In this session, I'm going to talk a little bit about equalizers, about how I think about them when I'm mastering a record, and a little bit about some of the differences in the way the mastering engineer thinks about them compared to a mixing engineer. The first thing I always like to put people's minds on is to think about why equalizers were invented in the first place. EQs were invented to compensate for deficiencies in recording medium and recording process, almost a century ago. They were invented in order to increase intelligibility over phone lines. So if we had a lot of high frequency loss in the transmission across a phone line, a high frequency boost would restore it so that you could actually understand what someone on the other end was saying. And that's the same idea is mapped to any recording technology. If you've got something that sounds a little too dull and you need to restore it to what the original sound was, if you're recording an acoustic instrument, for instance, you'd use an equalizer to bring it back to where it was before. And that same idea of a corrective equalizer is very much at play in mastering. In many cases, if you get like 12 tracks that have all been mixed in a couple, 3 days by the same engineer in the same room, sometimes it's just a matter of figuring out the inverse EQ to get the mixes sounding more like the mix engineer thought they sounded in the recording studio. And then you're working with that basic shape throughout the entire mastering session. I think mastering engineers in general find themselves cutting more than they boost. Sometimes we're just trying to cut out a little area of the program that's cloudy or where there's information that's full of unpleasant harmonic content and not much of the fundamental frequency of an instrument. One interesting tidbit is if you take a look at older style program equalizers, you'll notice that they're asymmetrical in their responses. And by asymmetrical, I mean that there's a different bandwidth when you boost with one of them as opposed to cutting with one of them. When you cut with them, the bandwidth is narrower, and when you boost with them, the bandwidth is much broader. And that just seems to be something that sounds better to our ears. It's sort of a psychoacoustic phenomenon. It's challenging to come up with a recipe for using an equalizer. Every program needs something different. And if you find yourself falling into a rut, always doing the same thing with every master that you're working on, chances are you're responding to something in your room or your monitors that's not even, as opposed to something in the program. Having said that, there are a few things that I think are more common when working in mastering. Usually there's some energy in the low mid-range that we find ourselves trying to clear out a little bit so that we reveal the bass a little bit better, or to separate a lead vocal from the bass, for instance, if you've got a pop or a rock or even a jazz tune with a vocal. And it's not uncommon to have to work on the low end. Low frequency information is notoriously inaccurate in mixing studios, and so the mastering engineer is often called on to fix the relationship between, a kick drum and a bass, or even the fundamental frequency of a kick drum compared to the attack of the kick drum or something like that. And you'd be amazed what you can do, even with just very, very small changes, to change those relationships and make the recording sound better. When I'm working with an equalizer and I'm mastering a project, if you were to take a look at the settings that I employed, you would notice that most of the boosts and cuts that I'm doing are no more than maybe half a dB or maybe a dB maximum. Occasionally there'll be a narrow cut where I'm cutting something by 1 or 2 dB, but you'll find that usually the moves are very small, particularly compared to what you might do in mixing. The reason for that is manyfold. You're working with a complex waveform, so and a balanced recording, usually it's not a solo instrument, so if you make big changes, you're likely to change the balance in the recording in a way that wouldn't reflect what the artist intended. The other side of that is that an EQ filter sounds better, has less distortion and less ringing if you use broad cues, in other words, a broad bandwidth, and are just making small moves with it. So sometimes when you're mastering, you'll use 5, 8, even 12 different EQ filters, but each one will just be doing a little bit. And so that's pretty typical of the mastering engineer's use of an equalizer. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this piece about EQ, and I hope you come back and watch future clips. I'll be talking about other things mastering.